It was the kind of morning that made people slow down, not because of traffic or chores or aches in the joints, but because of something quieter, something softer. The sky was the kind of blue that looked like it had been rinsed overnight, the wind just enough to lift the flags outside the auditorium, but not enough to chill the bones. Walter Greaves sat alone on the edge of the school parking lot, his truck a faded red Ford that had seen more states than most people. He stared through the windshield at the building where the ceremony would soon begin. In the passenger seat beside him, folded with care, was a program someone had mailed him weeks ago, a memorial service and honorary diploma ceremony for a high school student named Emily Wallace. She was his granddaughter, not by blood, not exactly. Emily was the daughter of Walter's late stepson. Her mother, Janine Wallace, had remarried and kept her maiden name, but Walter had stayed in touch, sporadically, awkwardly, like someone trying to hold onto a string that kept slipping between their fingers. And yet just months before Emily died, she'd sent him a letter, handwritten, blue ink, curly, youthful script. "Grandpa, promise me you'll come. Sit in the front row. Please." Walter had folded that letter 6 different ways since. The paper was soft now, creased at the edges, a little ink smudged from where his fingers had pressed too long. But the words were still there, as clear as ever. He didn't know why she wanted him there. They hadn't seen each other in almost 4 years. He wasn't the presentable grandpa type. No golf polos or tidy stories from retirement communities. Just old boots, a limp from the crash, and a memory full of people no one else remembered. But she'd asked, and so he came. At exactly 9:03 a.m., Walter stepped out of the truck. He adjusted the collar on his flight jacket, one from his old days as a para-rescue jumper, dark green with a faded rescue insignia on the left sleeve. Not quite dress clothes, but it was the best he had. He walked toward the auditorium doors with slow, deliberate steps, boots crunching softly on the gravel, his back slightly hunched from years of injuries and time. Inside, the auditorium buzzed with sound. Staff members bustled between rows of folding chairs. There were soft murmurs, camera flashes, children asking questions too loudly, parents reminding them to hush. Banners hung along the walls. Emily Wallace, a life remembered and celebrating. Perseverance, honoring love. Walter didn't use the front entrance like most. Habit, maybe, or instinct. He slipped in through the side door near the emergency exit, where the air smelled faintly of cleaner and old carpet. He stood at the threshold for a moment, letting his eyes adjust. The rows were nearly full. People in dark suits and pale dresses. Someone in a clergy collar. A man at the podium, flipping through notes. He walked along the wall slowly until he reached the front. There, roped off and marked with silver placards, were rows reserved for immediate family. A young usher in a navy dress approached him with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Sir?" she said gently. "These seats are for designated family only," Walter nodded. "My granddaughter's ceremony. She invited me. I should be on the list." The usher didn't check, just pointed subtly toward the back. "I'm sorry. We've had to be strict with attendance numbers. Please feel free to sit in the back section." Walter didn't argue. He just stepped back, quiet, respectful. He returned to the shadowed edge beneath the exit sign, hands behind his back, letter still in his coat pocket. He had no intention of leaving. Walter stood still by the exit door, like a shadow carved out. Of discipline. His hands remained folded behind his back, posture straight despite the deep ache in his left knee, the one that never healed right. His flight jacket hung a little loose on him now, but it still bore the stories of years nobody asked about. Most of the crowd hadn't noticed him. Not yet. Parents fidgeted with corsages. An older woman cried softly in the front row. Students dressed in matching blue robes and silver cords waited in folding chairs on stage. The event hadn't begun, but a sort of ceremonial hush had settled, a reverent anticipation, polite and contained. Walter didn't mind being ignored. He hadn't come for attention. He just wanted to be there when they said her name. But someone had noticed him. Seated 5 rows from the front, just left of center, a group of 4 men and 1 woman whispered among themselves. They weren't dressed like everyone else. No neckties, no flower pins. Their clothes were plain but neat, and each of them wore a pin on their left chest, a gold eagle and lightning bolt. Quiet symbols for those who knew what to look for. The youngest of the group, a man with close-cropped hair and sharp eyes, leaned forward slightly. His voice barely a murmur. "That's him." The woman next to him turned her head. "Greaves," he nodded. "Walter Greaves. I'd stake my badge on it." They fell silent, watching, remembering. Walter had no idea anyone in the room recognized him. He wasn't a legend, at least not in the way people thought of legends, but to a very specific group of people, those who'd served in the pararescue division during the Kandahar evacuations. His name was a whisper that carried weight. The man who pulled 3 survivors from the wreckage of Flight 421 when the engines exploded mid-air. The one who walked back into the smoke 3 times. The one who didn't leave until they were all out, even when it cost him everything below the knee. Walter didn't know they were here. He didn't even know if they remembered him. All he knew was that he'd been asked to come, and he had. He watched the crowd settle in. The head of school stepped onto the stage and adjusted the microphone. "Good morning, everyone," he began, voice practiced and composed. "Today we gather to celebrate not just academic achievements, but also a life lived with courage and grace." Applause scattered politely through the crowd. Walter didn't clap. He listened. The speech continued. There were tributes, awards, a slideshow of Emily's childhood, photos of her on swing sets, riding ponies, holding her mother's hand, laughing, in the hospital bed. Each one earned soft sniffles and tight smiles. Then the head of school cleared his throat. "And now, we'd like to acknowledge the family members who supported Emily throughout her fight." He gestured toward the front. Rose. "To her mother Janine, her stepfather Craig, and the wonderful family seated here today, thank you for being her rock." More applause, and then came the line that shifted something in the air. "We're honored to recognize those who were truly present for her in life and in spirit." It wasn't meant to wound, but it did. Walter didn't flinch. He just adjusted, his stance slightly. The creak in his hip groaned in protest, but he didn't shift again. Back in the 5th row, the woman in the group exhaled slowly through her nose. "That wasn't right," she said softly. The man beside her nodded once. "They don't know," another whispered. "We do." From her seat in the 3rd row, a silver-haired teacher, Mrs. Huxley, watched Walter closely now. She didn't know his name yet, but she remembered the story from the news. A high school girl pulled from the wreckage by an unknown rescuer. The man never gave a statement, never took credit. Just disappeared after the ambulance left. Mrs. Huxley clutched the program tightly in her lap and leaned toward the woman next to her. "Do you know who that man is?" she whispered. The woman shrugged. "Just some old guy. Probably wandered." In these events always attract extras. Extras. The word echoed like a crack in an otherwise silent chapel. Walter remained still, calm, like he'd been trained to do. The sounds around him were muffled now, distant applause, murmurs, music. But they barely touched him. He was here for one reason, to hear her name read aloud, to honor her, to do what he promised. From his coat pocket he pulled the letter again, held it just enough to feel the paper between his fingers, then returned it, folded neatly back into the place closest to his heart. In the 5th row, the quiet group was no longer whispering. They were waiting. They'd seen this before. Rooms that didn't know what they were seeing until it was too late, and they weren't about to let that happen again. The ceremony continued, just as it had been rehearsed. Names were read. Students stepped forward to receive posthumous diplomas on behalf of loved ones lost. A video montage played softly on the overhead screen, showing images of classmates who didn't make it to graduation. Applause was quiet but respectful. People dabbed their eyes, adjusted their posture, and reached for tissues in silence. Walter remained standing. He didn't shift. He didn't check his watch. The only motion was the subtle rise and fall of his chest with each breath, his eyes locked on the stage like it was sacred ground. Then came a small commotion, too quiet to draw attention from the front. but loud. Enough for those near the back to notice. A pair of staffers, one with a clipboard, one wearing a headset, approached him cautiously. The woman with the clipboard looked apologetic, but firm. "Sir, we understand this may be a difficult day, but unless you're on the list of approved family members, we have to ask you to leave the building." Walter didn't move. "I'm not causing trouble," he said, voice low and even. "My granddaughter wrote to me. She asked me to be here, to sit in the front row." The woman hesitated, glancing at the headset-wearing assistant, then back at her clipboard. "I'm sorry," she said, not unkindly, "but we can't verify that. We didn't receive any family authorization forms with your name, and we're already over capacity." Walter slowly reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. The gesture was deliberate, not aggressive, not hurried. From it, he pulled a small folded piece of paper. The edges were worn thin, corners curled, the creases almost frayed. He held it out, not to her, not as proof or defiance, but as if he were offering something sacred. "My granddaughter wrote this," he said, "before she passed." The woman didn't take the letter. She didn't even look at it. She only tightened her grip on the clipboard. "We need you to exit the room, sir." From across the auditorium, someone saw it happen. Mrs. Huxley, her heart caught in her throat. The way the man stood there, not angry, not begging, just holding a piece of paper, like it was the last string to a promise that had kept him going. That image gripped her in a way she couldn't name. She rose halfway from her seat, but she wasn't the first to move. 5 rows up on the right side, a chair scraped loudly against the floor. Heads turned, then another, and another. The group of 5, those quiet, watchful figures who had said nothing all morning, stood in unison. They didn't shout. They didn't call attention to themselves, but their presence changed the entire tone of the room, like someone had flicked a switch no one knew existed. The youngest among them stepped into the aisle. His gait was firm, measured, trained. He walked directly to Walter, standing now with 2 staffers on either side. The young man stopped just short of them, then slowly reached into the inner pocket of his blazer and pulled out something small and heavy. He extended his hand. Walter blinked, confused, until the overhead lights caught the object, a gold badge with silver wings. No words were needed. The Navy SEAL trident shone softly, unmistakably. Behind him, the others joined, each pulling out their own coin, badge, or pin. They didn't flash them. They didn't threaten anyone. They just stood, silent, present. The youngest SEAL turned to the staffer and said, voice low, but resonant, "That man doesn't leave this room. He led us out of fire. We followed him through hell. He stays." A wave moved through the auditorium, not sound, not noise, but awareness. The crowd shifted. People leaned forward. Conversations stopped. Phones lowered. Mrs. Huxley now stood completely. The woman in the headset stared at the badge, then at Walter. She still didn't speak. Walter didn't gloat. He didn't lift his chin. His eyes lowered slightly, as if, even now, he felt uncomfortable with the spotlight. "I'm just here because she asked me," he said. From the corner of the auditorium, another voice rose, not loud, but with weight. "His name is Walter Greaves." Everyone turned. The speaker was older, in a charcoal suit with a faint military stripe visible beneath the lapel. His face was weathered but dignified. He stepped forward, leaning on a cane, his voice steady. "He's the man who pulled Emily Wallace from the crash site in '09. While the rest of us were still running, he went back in. 3 times, he carried her out when everyone else said there was no chance." Gasps rippled through the seats. The dean of the school, seated on stage, blinked, slowly stood. "You saved Emily's life?" Walter hesitated. "She saved mine first," he said quietly. "With that letter." He patted the coat pocket again. The woman with the clipboard didn't speak. She just took a half-step back. One by one, the crowd began to rise. No one told them to. They just did. For Walter. The man who'd been told to leave had now become the one no one could ignore. There's a kind of silence that doesn't belong to grief or confusion. It belongs to recognition. Pure, startled recognition. The kind that sneaks in under the bones and makes people straighten their backs without even knowing why. That silence filled the room now. Walter Greaves, the man who had stood unnoticed in the shadows just minutes earlier, now stood surrounded by 5 Navy SEALs and a growing wall of attention. But he wasn't basking in it. He didn't smile. He didn't nod. His expression remained soft, almost embarrassed, as if being seen like this somehow violated the quiet contract he'd always had with life. Across the auditorium, Janine Wallace, Emily's mother, had begun to rise. She had been seated in the center of the reserved row, flanked by her husband Craig and extended family. Her lips were parted slightly, her program clutched tightly in both hands. Craig leaned toward her and whispered something she didn't register. Her eyes never left Walter. The dean stepped toward the mic again. His composure had cracked just slightly. The next words trembled. I wasn't aware. Mr. Greaves, please, if you would like, you are welcome to take a seat up front. We would be honored. Walter didn't move. He didn't speak. Instead, he turned slightly, as if asking the SEALs behind him what he should do, what was right. But they said nothing. They just stood there, eyes forward, not guarding him, not guiding him, just backing him. The moment hung like breath before a storm. Then came another voice, clear, youthful, shaking. That's my grandfather. Everyone turned. At the edge of the stage, behind the final row of seated graduates, a young man in a blue robe stood with trembling hands. His cap sat slightly off-center, tassel brushing his cheek. His face was pale, flushed with emotion, and his throat bobbed hard as he swallowed. He stepped forward to the podium without waiting for permission. My name is Ethan Wallace, Emily's cousin. The crowd stilled again. She didn't talk much about that day, the crash, the fire, what happened after. But she talked about one thing, always one thing. Ethan's voice cracked, but he pressed on. The man who wouldn't leave her, who held her hand through smoke and told her she wasn't going to die, who carried her with a broken leg and no backup. She called him her guardian angel. He turned toward Walter. That's you, Grandpa. Walter's lips parted, but no sound came out. Ethan took a deep breath and stepped off the stage. He walked with slow, careful steps down the center aisle, eyes locked on the man beneath the exit sign. His robe fluttered slightly as he moved, his hands clenched into nervous fists. When he reached Walter, he didn't stop. He raised his hand and saluted, not as a performance, not out of tradition, but because no handshake could say what needed to be said. Walter's breath hitched. He didn't salute back. He just reached out and placed his hand gently on Ethan's shoulder. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Ethan whispered something only Walter heard. She said you saved her body, but it was the letter you saved that kept her spirit alive. Behind them, the SEALs stood straighter. Ethan turned to the crowd, voice breaking again. He wasn't on your list, but he was the reason Emily was on any list, and with that, he stepped aside. Janine Wallace rose, slowly, her steps hesitant, her face unreadable. She moved toward Walter as if unsure whether to embrace him or apologize, or both. When she reached him, she looked him in the eye. I didn't know, she said. Walter shook his head. You didn't need to. Tears welled in her eyes. She extended her hand, not for a handshake, but to guide him. Come sit, she said, where you were supposed to be. And the crowd parted. Just like that. The roped-off aisle that had been guarded like a fortress now opened wide, not because anyone ordered it, but because no one dared block it any longer. Walter Greaves didn't rush. His steps were slow, the limp more visible now, each footfall steady, the sound of worn soles against tile echoing in a room that had finally learned how to listen. Ethan walked beside him. Janine walked ahead. And behind him the SEALs followed, not in formation, not for show, but out of respect. Their place, as always, was behind him. The people in the rows didn't applaud, not yet. They simply turned and watched. Something had shifted in them, too. What started as a ceremony had become something deeper, not a performance, not a memorial, but a quiet reckoning with gratitude. At the front row, Janine stopped and gestured to the empty seat beside her. Walter looked at it. And then, slowly, sat. For the first time all morning, he rested. Not because he was tired, but because he belonged. The auditorium held its breath. For just a few moments after Walter Greaves sat down, no one moved. No one shuffled papers. No one even blinked too hard. The air itself seemed to pause, suspended in the weight of what had just happened. Janine sat beside him, her hands folded neatly in her lap, but her eyes shimmered. Every so often she glanced sideways at Walter, as if still trying to place him. In the story that had been too quietly written outside the margins of her daughter's life, Ethan remained standing just behind them, unsure whether to return to his place among the graduates or to stay beside the man who, only moments earlier, had nearly been escorted out. The dean returned to the podium, but he no longer held his notes. His voice was different now, not polished, not rehearsed. It was human. "We are honored today," he began slowly, "to be joined by guests of distinction. Some we recognized too late, but we recognize them now." He stepped back without adding anything else, and then something extraordinary happened. No fanfare. No music cue, just applause, soft at first, scattered but pure. A pair of hands near the back began to clap, then 2 more, then 10, then 50, until the sound rolled like a wave from the back of the room to the front, building with each row that stood. But no one who stood clapped with abandon. There were no cheers, no whistles. It wasn't the applause of celebration, it was the applause of reverence. Walter didn't smile. He didn't nod. He simply lowered his head slightly, as if bowing not to the room, but to the moment. As if he, more than anyone, knew that applause should never be sought. It should be earned, quietly, when no one is looking, and accepted when it finds you. The 6 seals remained behind him, still upright, still at attention. Their eyes forward, their arms at their sides, their presence now fully understood by everyone in that auditorium. Mrs. Huxley, still standing from her seat 3 rows back, wiped a tear from the edge of her glasses and whispered to no one in particular, "I hope someone remembers this day." On stage, the next speaker hesitated, then quietly stepped aside. She knew, everyone knew, nothing that followed would carry more weight than what had just happened, and yet the ceremony continued. Emily's name was called. Her diploma, trimmed in gold, was presented to Janine. Janine did not rise alone. She looked to Walter. He nodded once, slow and sure. They walked together. Ethan followed, and when Janine accepted the framed diploma from the dean, she did something that no one had planned. She turned to Walter and handed it to him. "I held her through her childhood," she said, voice trembling, "but you held her through the fire." Walter didn't take the diploma, not right away. He looked at Janine, then at the frame. Then he reached inside his jacket one last time. The letter. He held it up beside the diploma. 1 hand for each. 1 from her. 1 for her. Then he passed the diploma back to Janine and tucked the letter close to his heart once more. The room exhaled. Behind him, the seals finally broke their stillness. One by one, they stepped forward, not toward the stage, not toward the crowd, but toward Walter. The youngest among them reached into his pocket and pressed something into Walter's palm. Small, round, heavy. A challenge coin. Walter turned it. Over in his hand, on one side the emblem of their SEAL team, on the other 5 engraved words, "The quiet ones lead loudest wars." Walter didn't cry, but something in his shoulders softened just slightly, like the weight he'd carried for so long had finally found a resting place, not gone, but shared, and that mattered. That meant everything. As the ceremony wound down, the official remarks faded into background hum. No one remembered the name of the valedictorian. No one remembered the jokes or the planned transitions. But everyone remembered him, the man who stood quietly at the back of the room, until the whole room stood for him. The ceremony ended, but no one rushed for the exits. People lingered in their seats like they'd just stepped out of something sacred, like if they moved too fast, they'd break it. The stage lights dimmed. The overhead projector clicked off with a soft hum. A janitor stood quietly in the far corner, leaning on a mop handle, watching without moving. Even the usual scramble for photo ops was slower, softer, like everyone had forgotten what they were supposed to do next. Walter remained seated, his back straight, hands resting gently on his thighs, eyes lowered, not out of sadness but something more reflective. a calm that wasn't empty, but full. Janine sat beside him, occasionally glancing at him like she still couldn't quite believe he was real. Ethan, still in his cap and gown, stood just behind them, hands in his pockets, gaze bouncing between his mother and grandfather and the now quiet rows of chairs. One by one, people began to pass by. At first it was quiet, just a few teachers, then a retired coach. They didn't say much. Some offered a soft thank you. Others just touched Walter's shoulder in passing, a gesture that said more than words ever could. Then came a student, a young woman with streaks of mascara still visible beneath her eyes. Her cap was gone, hair falling to her shoulders, hands wringing nervously. She didn't speak at first, she just stood there. Walter looked up gently. The girl swallowed, then brought her fingers to her temple in a shaky salute. It was imperfect, but sincere. "Thank you for carrying her," she whispered. Walter nodded. "She carried me too." More students followed. One laid a single white rose on the chair beside Walter. Another, a tall young man in a wrinkled robe, reached out to shake his hand, then instead pulled him into a brief, respectful hug. Each one had a story they didn't share. But the way they looked at him, like they had just realized how many people walk through life unrecognized, and how close they'd come to overlooking one more, told Walter everything. And he sat through it all quietly, humbly, as if trying to make room inside himself for the weight of their gratitude. Off to the side, Mrs. Huxley still hadn't moved. From her seat, she clutched her program like it might disappear if she let go, watching each interaction like a witness who couldn't turn away. Eventually she rose. She walked toward Walter slowly, carefully, heels clicking gently on the auditorium floor. She stopped a few feet away and waited for him to look up. When he did, she smiled. "You don't know me," she said, voice warm, aged, but steady. "But I've been teaching here for 31 years. I thought I'd seen the most important lessons already. I was wrong." Walter tilted his head, waiting. "Today," she continued, "you reminded a lot of us that it's not just about being seen. It's about showing up anyway, even when you're told not to." She extended her hand. He took it gently with both of his. "Thank you," she said. Then she turned, stepped aside, and let the next in line pass. Janine leaned toward Walter again. "You didn't have to come," she said softly. He looked at her calm. "She asked me." They sat together for a few more moments as the crowd slowly filtered out. The remaining SEALs stood nearby, silent guardians, still not returning to their seats. Still at attention, Ethan finally broke the silence. "Grandpa, can I ask you something?" Walter turned to him. "Of course. Why didn't you say anything sooner? Why didn't you tell us you were the one who saved her?" Walter smiled faintly. It wasn't a smile of pride. It was something quieter, closer to acceptance. "Because that was her story," he said, "not mine." Ethan blinked, the weight of that answer settling in his chest like a stone that felt good to carry. In the far back, two janitors waited patiently. Neither spoke. One finally approached and asked kindly if they needed more time. Janine looked to Walter. "Are you ready?" Walter nodded, his body slowly rising from the chair. The creak in his knee was louder now, but it didn't matter. He had done what he came to do. He looked around one last time. Rows of folding chairs, faint echoes of applause, a stage now empty. And yet, something had been left behind in the air, something thick and intangible, as if the room itself remembered. Walter reached into his pocket one final time, pulled out the letter, read it silently, then folded it back. The words weren't fading, they were just part of him now. The doors to the auditorium swung open with a soft, echoing hush, letting in the warm, mid-afternoon light. Outside, the spring air felt heavier, like even the clouds were catching their breath after what had just unfolded inside. Walter Greaves stepped out slowly, one hand lightly on Janine's shoulder, the other tucked into the pocket of his old flight jacket. Ethan walked just ahead, his graduation gown fluttering behind him, his head turning every so often to make sure Walter was still close. Behind them, the crowd followed, but not in clusters of excitement or ceremony. They came quietly, in ones and twos like mourners at the end of a eulogy. Not because someone had died, but because something deep had been honored, something unspoken. At the edge of the courtyard, Walter paused. The folding chairs were still being stacked by volunteers. Balloons had begun to sag in the sunlight. A discarded program drifted across the concrete like a forgotten souvenir of a moment no one would truly forget. He turned back toward the building, gazing one last time at the tall windows of the auditorium. "You, all right?" Janine asked gently. Walter nodded. "I think so." Ethan took a few steps toward a bench and gestured for them to sit. Walter hesitated, then gave in, easing himself onto the bench with the same caution he'd shown on deployment. As if even sitting was an act of strategy now. They sat in silence for a while. Birds chirped faintly overhead. A lawnmower droned in the distance, but none of it really touched the moment. Finally, Ethan broke the quiet. "I think she knew." Walter looked at him. "Emily," Ethan continued, "I think she knew you'd come, even if nobody else did." Walter took a deep breath and let it out slowly. "She always saw things other people missed." Ethan smiled faintly. "Like you." Walter chuckled under his breath. "Maybe." Just then a young couple approached, a woman in her 30s holding a toddler on her hip, and a man with a prosthetic arm tucked into the pocket of his jacket. The man stopped in front of Walter and extended his good hand. "Excuse me," he said, his voice slightly rough with emotion. "I served in Afghanistan. I wasn't in your unit, but I knew your name." Walter looked up, surprised. The man continued, "We heard about what you did on Flight 421. We traded the story around base for weeks. Nobody knew where you went after that." Walter looked down, quiet. "I didn't go far," he said simply. The man smiled and nodded. "You made it possible for 5 people to come home. That's not far. That's everywhere." The woman stepped forward next. "My brother was one of them. He didn't talk much about it, but he kept your name in his journal." Walter's face tightened just slightly, but he nodded again. "Thank you for telling me." The woman placed her hand gently on Walter's shoulder and whispered, "You were her miracle, thank you." They stepped away quietly, giving space. Ethan watched them go, then turned to his grandfather. "I didn't know you were that person." Walter looked at him carefully. "I'm not. I'm just a man who didn't want to let someone die alone." Janine, sitting beside them, had tears on her cheeks again, but she didn't wipe them away this time. "You were there when it counted," she said. "That's more than most people can say." Walter didn't reply, but the way he looked at her said everything. A breeze moved through the courtyard then, lifting the corner of Ethan's gown and ruffling Walter's white hair. Something light fell to the pavement beside the bench. The letter. It had slipped from Walter's coat pocket. Ethan bent to retrieve it and held it gently in both hands, reading the front. "Grandpa, promise me you'll come." He looked at Walter. "Do you mind if I read it?" Walter hesitated, then nodded. Ethan unfolded it carefully. The ink was faded in places, smudged near the signature, but the handwriting was still clear, full of loops and slants that only a 17-year-old girl could have written. "Dear Grandpa, I know we haven't seen each other in a long time, and maybe you think I forgot you. But I didn't. I remember the stories. I remember how you always showed up when no one else would. If you're reading this, I guess I'm not around anymore. But if you can come, please sit in the front row. Even if they say you can't, even if they don't know who you are, I know, I always knew. Love, Emily." Ethan's hands trembled. He passed the letter back to Walter like it was something holy. Walter didn't take it right away. He just looked at it. Then finally he folded it one more time, gently, reverently, and placed it back into his coat pocket. "I made a promise," he said, "and I kept it." Janine nodded slowly. She'd be proud. They sat like that, for a while longer, letting the moment settle, letting the world catch up. Then Walter rose, not quickly, but strong. Because the day was done, but the story wasn't. By the time Walter Greaves pulled out of the school parking lot in his old red Ford, most of the crowd had already gone. The balloons had been deflated. The banner with Emily's name fluttered one last time before a volunteer cut it down. Walter didn't look back in the mirror. He didn't need to. The day had already etched itself into his memory in the way only a few days in life ever do. Not because they were loud or grand, but because they changed something quiet inside you forever. He drove in silence. No music. No talk radio. Just the hum of the engine and the stretch of Oregon Road bending gently beneath the wheels. Trees blurred past in early spring green, and sunlight streamed through the cracked windshield in long, uneven streaks. In his shirt pocket, the folded letter pressed lightly against his chest with every breath. It wasn't heavy. It was just present. When he reached home, an old A-frame cabin tucked between two pine-covered ridges, he parked beside the shed and sat in the driver's seat for a moment. The truck clicked softly as it cooled. He was tired, but not from the drive, not from standing too long. It was a different kind of tired, the kind that comes when you've been invisible for so long that being seen feels like it might break you, open if you don't hold yourself just right. He stepped out and stretched slowly, his back cracking in 3 places. His left knee protested, like always, but it didn't slow him down. Inside, the house smelled faintly of cedar and old coffee grounds. Everything was neat, lived in, books stacked beside the armchair, a small American flag folded tightly in a wooden case by the mantel. He poured himself a glass of water and sat. He didn't turn on the lights, didn't turn on the television. He just sat, hands resting on his thighs, shoulders gently rounded forward, breathing slowly. In the hush of that old cabin, time didn't matter, but memory did. He opened a drawer in the corner of the room and pulled out a wooden box. The lid creaked when he opened it. Inside were letters, dozens of them. Some old and yellowed, others newer, some written in a woman's hand, some in a child's, some typed, some scratched in pencil on lined paper that had seen too much rain. Added Emily's letter to the top of the stack, then closed the box. That should have been the end of it, but it wasn't. Because while Walter returned to his quiet routines, chopping firewood, reading weather-worn maps, cleaning out the gutters, something began to shift in the world beyond his trees. It started with a photo. A student at the ceremony had snapped. A picture, a candid one, of Walter seated in the front row, surrounded by 6 Navy SEALs standing quietly behind him. No caption. Just the image. She posted it on a small social media page for the graduating class of 2025. A tribute. It didn't take long. Someone else commented, "That's the man from the story, isn't it? The one who carried Emily out of the crash." Someone else added, "I thought he was just a guest. I didn't realize." And the ripple began. The photo made its way to the local news page, then a veterans group, then to a reporter who remembered the 2009 crash and had always wondered why the name of the rescuer had never been released. They found it now. Walter Greaves, former USAF pararescue jumper, survivor of Kandahar, hero of Flight 421. It wasn't long before people began reaching out. At first, Walter didn't answer. He let the phone ring, let the emails sit unanswered. He didn't want the noise. He hadn't gone to the ceremony to become a headline. He had gone for a promise. But something began to soften in him. One letter, then another. A handwritten card from a stranger in Idaho. A crayon drawing from a little girl in Kentucky whose father was in the Navy. A retired schoolteacher from Maine. Wrote, "Your silence taught louder than most speeches I've heard in 70 years. He pinned that one on the fridge. The ripple spread further. The dean of the school called personally, left a voicemail full of apology and admiration. The school board sent an official statement, and someone from the staff returned Emily's program, laminated with a note that simply read, "For the man who sat where no one let him, until we all understood why he had to." Walter didn't reply to most of it, but he read everything. Then, on a quiet Sunday morning, he did something unexpected. He wrote a letter, not long, not detailed, just a few lines. "To those who carry burdens no one claps for, you are seen. You are remembered, and sometimes the most sacred thing you can do is just show up." He didn't sign it, but he mailed it to the high school, asking them to read it during next year's graduation. He didn't expect a reply, but deep down, something in him hoped they would. Spring rolled into early summer, and life in the hills, went on. The birds returned to their nests. The creek swelled with melted snow. The air smelled of bark and old sunlight, and Walter Greaves remained in his cabin beneath the pines, unchanged in routine, but not untouched. Something inside him had shifted, not in a loud or dramatic way. It was subtle, like the way the weight of snow presses down on a roof, unnoticed until the moment it lifts. He still woke early, still made coffee in the dented percolator he'd used since '93, still tied his boots the same way he had when boarding. Rescue helicopters years ago, tight, deliberate, left before right. But now there were small changes. The stack of unopened letters on the table, they were opened. The bookshelf, a new photo frame had appeared, one taken at the ceremony showing him seated in the front row with 6 men behind him, their expressions solemn and loyal. He never asked for a copy. It just arrived one day, tucked, in a simple envelope with no return address. The note inside said only, "Sir, we followed you into the fire once. We'd do it again. J.C." He placed that letter beneath the photo. The cabin was quiet, but it no longer felt like a place of retreat. It felt like a post, something active, lived in, watched over. A few days later, the postman arrived with a package, an envelope, thick, cream-colored, embossed with the seal of the state. Inside, a letter from the governor's office, along with a formal invitation to attend a veterans recognition ceremony in Salem. Walter read it once, twice, then folded it up and placed it beside Emily's letter. He didn't decide right away, he didn't have to. He had already done the most important thing, he had shown up. Back in town, things had changed too. The students talked about the ceremony, differently than past classes had, not because of the decorations or the speeches, but because of that moment, the one where everything stopped and everyone understood something they hadn't before. The teachers spoke of Walter with reverence, not as a war hero but as a kind of compass, the kind of person who didn't ask the world for permission to matter. Mrs. Huxley, the longtime teacher, shared his story with her new students each semester. He didn't demand a seat, she would say. He waited, and in doing so, he taught us who we really are when we're forced to choose whether to look away or step forward. At next year's graduation, a folded letter was placed on every chair, typed in black ink, its words anonymous. To those who carry burdens no one claps for, you are seen, you are remembered. And sometimes, the most sacred thing you can do is just show up. No one knew exactly where it came from, but everyone knew who it was for. One morning, months later, a familiar knock came at Walter's door. It was Ethan, older now. More sure of himself, he held a duffel bag and a printed college acceptance letter in his hand. "I wanted to tell you first," he said, standing in the doorway. "I'm going to study emergency medicine." Walter raised an eyebrow, a soft smirk forming. Ethan shrugged. "Figure I could learn how to do what you did, not just the rescue part, the showing up part." Walter said nothing for a moment. Then he stepped back and opened the door wider. Inside, he poured 2 cups of coffee. No cream, no sugar, just the way it had always been. They sat at the small table as the morning light filtered through the trees. "You'll be good at it," Walter finally said. Ethan smiled. "You think so?" Walter nodded. "Because you understand one thing. Most don't." "What's that?" Walter looked him straight in the eye. "When you love someone and the world forgets them, you don't walk away. You walk toward them, even if the room says you don't belong." Ethan didn't respond right away, but he didn't need to. Some lessons don't require answers, just presence. Later that evening, after Ethan had gone, Walter stepped outside. The air was cool. The stars came out slowly, one by one, like soldiers, called to formation. He looked up at the sky for a long time. Then, without ceremony, without an audience, he saluted, not to the flag, not to the cabin, but to the promise kept, to the girl who had asked him to come, to the room that had finally remembered what honor looks like, to the quiet truth that had taken a lifetime to fully understand. You don't need a spotlight to be seen. You just need to keep showing up. Years pass, photos fade, programs yellow. Names are added to school plaques and sometimes forgotten just as quietly, but not all names, not all stories. At Harrison Ridge High School, the auditorium still looks the same on the surface. The same rows of folding chairs, the same podium with the school crest, the same stage lighting that flickers during summer months. But something changed after that day. Walter Greaves sat in the front row. Every year now, just before the graduates file in, just before the crowd rises for the national anthem, the head of school walks to the microphone and begins with a story. Not about a valedictorian, not about a scholarship, but about a man who waited at the back of the room until the room remembered where he belonged. They call it the Greaves opening. It's short, honest, and never dramatized, but it sets the tone. Before we begin, the principal says each June, let's remember the quiet heroes, the ones whose names might not be printed on the program, but whose presence means everything. Those who keep promises even when no one's watching. Those who stand quietly at the back of the room until the room turns around. No one claps after the speech. They don't need to. The weight of it has already settled. In the hallway, just outside the auditorium, where student awards and team photos are usually displayed, there's a framed letter behind glass. Emily Wallace's letter, folded open, preserved just as Walter had kept it. Next to it, a small brass plaque, to the man who showed us the meaning of honor, not through words but by walking through the door anyway. Visitors pass it every day. Some stop and read, most don't. But once a year, a group of 6 Navy men, now older, grayer, slower, send a small bouquet and a note. Still standing behind him always, they sign only with initials. As for Walter, he never returned to another ceremony, never wanted a stage, never accepted an interview. But every now and then a new letter would arrive. A student, a parent, a soldier. They didn't ask for advice. They just wanted to tell him they'd started showing up. At the funerals, no one wanted to attend. At the hospital rooms, others had grown tired of visiting. At the graduations of cousins, neighbors, siblings, because someone had to be there. Someone had to make sure the front row didn't sit empty when it mattered. In the final winter of his life, Walter sat again in his favorite chair by the fire, the folded letter on the mantel where he could see it. Outside, snow fell in slow, steady flakes, blanketing the trees like silence made visible. He wasn't afraid, he wasn't lonely. He had already heard everything he ever needed to hear in the quiet of one auditorium when 6 men stood and the world turned to listen. When he passed, the letter was found in his jacket pocket, creased, faded, softened by time. But the words still legible. Grandpa, promise me you'll come. He had, and by the time he left this world, the whole room had stood, not for a war hero, not for a rescue legend, not even for a grandfather, but for a man who understood something the world often forgets. That love is proven not by how loudly we speak, but by how faithfully we show up when asked.